This is Criteria.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Criteria. I'm one of your co-hosts, Thomas Miras here. The other co-host, James Majewski, is not here today, but thankfully I have a guest, so I won't just be talking into a camera by myself. Today, we'll be doing a little bit of a review of the new film Dune Part 1, directed by Denis Villeneuve, based on the 1965 very, very influential sci-fi novel. And with me to discuss this is someone who probably knows at least a bit more about Dune than I do. Father Brendon Laroche, who previously joined me on the Catholic Culture podcast to discuss the great Catholic sci-fi author Gene Wolfe. Father Brendon is a priest of the Diocese of Allentown, Pennsylvania, and Catholic chaplain at Muhlenberg College. Father Brendon, welcome to Criteria.
Glad to be here.
So I've read Dune once, probably 4 or 5 years ago. Found it very complex, enjoyed it. I felt like I'd have to read it again to really get a handle on everything that was going on with all the politics and stuff. I think you've read it, you said 3 or 4 times, yeah?
Yes, I've read the first novel, Dune proper, the one that gets adapted, the one that's being adapted by Denis Villeneuve. I've read that probably, at this point, I'm probably in the middle of my 6th or 7th reading. I've read the rest of Frank Herbert's books at least once. And I've read some of his sons, Brian Herbert's work with Kevin Anderson. I've read some of those and as well, which are interesting. I mean, I don't think they're of necessarily the same level because obviously they're coming from notes and being filled out. And but Kevin Anderson has done a number of good things.
Yeah, well, I've only read the original Dune book. I do have Dune Messiah. So tell me, at what point does it become at what point do they stop being worth reading, or sort of like essential Dune reading? To
really get everything that Paul is trying to do and that his son and daughter pick up on, probably the first 3. So Dune Messiah, Children of Dune. If you're going to talk about the sequel that stands kind of shoulder to shoulder with the original, a lot of people would say God Emperor, which gets a little weird. A couple thousand years later,
sure.
Leto II is a sandworm. But, it kind of towers, insofar as you want to talk about philosophical and political sci-fi, it kind of towers above the rest.
Okay.
It really never finishes. Frank Herbert died before he could finish, so the first 2 books that Kevin Anderson and Brian Herbert wrote were like his big notes for his final book that ended up being 2 books. One of them is called Sandworms of Dune. I can't remember off the top of my head the other one. But yeah, it gets odd. I think that the sequels are kind of important because at least one of the things that's important is, I think, from my perspective, that the point of Dune is that everybody's like, oh, Paul's this Messiah. And I think the answer is, he's not.
I don't know if there really is a Lord of the Rings of science fiction, but in terms of its influence, I would guess, and I'm wondering if you would agree with this, that Dune is probably the most influential work of speculative fiction that is fantasy or sci-fi of the 20th century, other than second to Lord of the Rings. Do you think that's the case? A single work.
I think that certainly the argument can be made. I think there's a lot of things that come from there. There's plenty of sci-fi books or science fantasy books that have a God Emperor. I mean, that's a big thing in the Warhammer 40,000 thing. People have been making those comparisons on Twitter and social media, like, oh my goodness, this is just like Warhammer but serious. It's like, where do you think these terms come from? And then there is, and I always think, to me, with with Tolkien, and Herbert stands with Tolkien and Wolfe just as 3 people who can really build a world, but also tell an interesting story. Not always that you're going to always get everything the first time you read it. Certainly for Wolfe, especially, as we talked about previously, sometimes you got to read it more than once.
Yeah.
But I think the 3 of them are very much in my mind, just to me, if you're going to talk about like what really influences what we now consider to be the genre of speculative fiction, of science fiction and fantasy, those would be kind of the three main players. Not that there aren't other important players. Not that I don't think there's a great importance to the pulp authors who came before, and all those kind of things. I really do think there's probably something broader if you really wanted to get into a deep study of the genre as it arose in the late 19th and early 20th century. But I would say that, in the public consciousness, Frank Herbert stands up there in that way. And there's a lot of ideas related to psychic powers, related to terminology like the God Emperor, related to the use of psychedelics or whatever as a means of getting power. I don't know if the psychedelic is the right word for the spice melange, but something like that, psychoactive or whatever. I think those certainly are things that seeped into the consciousness and get used now by authors who have copied a copy and maybe don't even know where it came from originally if they've only read very modern things, and yet I think that they're there. So I would say he deserves that in that respect. I think at least it's arguable.
Yeah, and in reading the book, I was kind of just focused on wrestling with the book because it is fairly dense. But in seeing the movie, I was really struck by the influences. I mean, obviously Star Wars is somewhat significantly influenced by Dune, at least on a kind of an aesthetic level, kind of a relatively, even if on a superficial with the desert planet and that sort of thing, they're moisture farmers. My co-host who's normally with me here, we saw it together and he observed, I haven't seen or read Game of Thrones, but he said that Game of Thrones sort of begins very much like Dune with these warring houses and this noble duke and betrayal. And then I was thinking about the Wheel of Time series by Robert Jordan. Boy, I can't think that the central concept of that book doesn't come straight from Dune, because that also is about this order of sort of Machiavellian, very powerful female sorceresses who both anticipate and fear the coming of a much, much more powerful male with the same abilities.
Wow. I never thought of that, but that's really true, especially because the Kwisatz Haderach is supposed to have abilities like he can use both sides or something. And if I remember correctly, it's been a while since I've read any Wheel of Time, but that was the thing with the dragon. Like the dragon can use aspects of magic as a male that the females can't, and those are destructive aspects or something that can be dangerous.
Well, it's that. Yeah, it's something like he's been the right half of this kind of whatever the magical force that they tap into. I can't remember what it is, but has been tainted. Mm-hmm. And so the female parts, they basically sort of like seal it off, and they kind of like basically like psychically like spay any males who have this ability, but the fear because any males who use it gradually go insane and wreak havoc. So anyway, there's definitely resonances. I can't imagine that that's not from Dune. The first Wheel of Time book in particular lifts very, very heavily from Lord of the Rings, but thinking about it in connection with Dune, I could see the similarity as well. So Denis Villeneuve is this is the first of his films that I've seen, but I know that he is kind of gotten a reputation as a director of serious sci-fi films with Blade Runner 2049 and things like that. And so he'd wanted to adapt this or at least loved the book since he was 14, I think he said. And he's kind of seems like the perfect person to take this on because he's not like a crazy avant-garde guy like David Lynch, but he's somebody who will take the sci-fi concept seriously and not just turn it into a big dumb kind of thing. And it was kind of cool to see just on that level, because it's so rare to see fantasy or sci-fi it's done in a serious manner, with kind of like due attention paid to the lore and kind of takes its time in developing the world, especially in the first half of this film. And the film itself is really just the first half of the story and kind of set up for what's to come. So I appreciate it on that level. Another thing that I really appreciated about it was just and I really felt like I did when I was watching The Lord of the Rings in this respect, is the kind of the visual concept and the solidity with which it's fleshed out, and the setting, the visual setting, I thought was really excellent. So how did you feel about the sort of like the atmosphere and the kind of the visual concept in relation to adapting the books?
I thought he did an excellent job in that. There were little things, like if you've read the books, for example, one thing I noticed I thought was very good. In David Lynch's version of kind of film backstory, he had the Irulan voiceovers, which makes sense if you've read the book, because every chapter starts with Princess Irulan, who you don't really meet as a character until the end of the first book. She has all these little. She's written a lot about Paul, about the Muad'Dib, and so she's got all these little. There's all these little flavor quotes from things she's written that kind of put perspective into chapters and help you gain a broader perspective over the book of the concrete things you're seeing Paul do. And so that was an interesting thing to do. And the when David Lynch did it, and the kind of the internal, like the almost like comic book panel headshots, close up voiceover of the things that are thinking. But obviously, Denis Villeneuve went a different direction. One of the things I thought is there are a lot of subtle things that really conveyed if you've read the book, or if you read the book later, or as things get fleshed out, even if you just look at Wikipedia's or whatever, that like when Thufir or Peter were asked different things, the Mentats, there are these moments where their eyes roll back in their head while they give you an answer. This kind of idea that they cut off their sensory perspective to do that computation very quickly. Because the idea of the Mentats in the book are they're human computers. Literally, they do in their head what the humans who are called computers used to do with styluses and abacuses and abaci, I guess it would be, before we had counting machines, which doing these rapid calculations, because in the Dune universe, you don't have AI or cyborgs because of bad things in the past. Allowing
that's not explicitly explained in the movie. It's only explained insofar as the spice, it's said that the spice is necessary for space travel, for navigation, but it doesn't explain why, nor does it really explain who the Mentats are. We see these two guys with a stripe on their lips who are kind of advisors to the
But it's interesting because like if you know what a Mentat is, if you read the book, that makes perfect sense. And as a visual cue of what's going on, like these people are thinking really fast. You can get that from just that little visual cue. And then if you like read the books later, you're like, oh wow, that makes sense. I get why he chose to do that visual cue. And so there are a lot of things I saw that are little visual cues which really give the audience, on at least a subconscious level, I think, a kind of visceral understanding of certain things that maybe they couldn't explain. But if they then read the books, or if they even then just look deeper into, like, wonder what a Mentat is, where's the Dune wiki, or whatever. That makes sense. Even stuff like when Leto, when they were, he saved those miners and said he didn't care about the spice. There's this quick cut to Kynes looking at him almost dumbfounded, but also, like that's the chapter that ends in the book with the thought, I like this Duke, and so we didn't have to have those voiceovers as David Lynch did. And yet, nonetheless, there's something implied, like why does Kynes later help out? Well, because he respects, or she in the movie, she learned to respect Leto because he wasn't the Harkonnens, he wasn't even the Corrinos, the Emperor. He cared about people, in a real extent, and some of that we see is obviously calculation, because he wants to forge an alliance with the Fremen to be able to stand against the Padishah Emperor, against the Emperor and stuff. But some of that I think is and supposed to be, I think even in the book, there's an authenticity to Leto as a man who really holds his responsibilities a real thing. He's not perfect. He doesn't always do that well all the time. But that's part of who he is, and part of it.
You almost get the sense that he's the one straight shooter in a world of Machiavellian,
and that is very kind of,
and he inspires that kind of loyalty in his men for that.
And that reason is, as you said, very opening of Game of Thrones. The one guy who is as close as you can say is a good guy in this kind of backstabbing political universe kind of gets, he gets the short end of the stick because nobody's willing to have that. That's dangerous. Such a man can be dangerous. So we got to get rid of him.
Yeah. Just a quick break to let you know about CatholicCulture.org's fall fundraising campaign. The podcast is, as you may or may not know, a production of the website Catholic Culture, as are our other 3 podcasts, the Catholic Culture Podcast, which I host, Catholic Culture Audiobooks, and Way of the Fathers with Mike Aquilina. Catholic Culture is a non-commercial, not-for-profit organization. It's completely dependent on user support, and we have a lot of things besides our 4 podcasts going on, a lot of news, commentary, a liturgical year section, a large library of Catholic documents, papal encyclicals, church fathers' writings, and much more. This year's campaign is focused on helping us to hire technical staff that we need to keep things going around here, and also just to pay for our normal production costs, to pay for our writers, all of our podcasts, our web hosting costs, normal run-of-the-mill expenses. So again, if you enjoy this podcast, remember that it only runs on user funding. So maybe you've been meaning to give, but you haven't had a chance to do it yet. Now is a great time for that because we've been offered by a group of generous donors a $105,000 challenge grant, which will ensure that Catholic Culture is able to continue through 2022. So if we can reach $105,000, that number will be doubled. Now, the easiest way for you to support our work is to become a sustaining member, which you can do for as little as $5 a month. It's quick and easy to set up. And again, for the period of fall 2021, your donations will be doubled. If you'd like your contribution to go directly to our podcast programming, you can go to catholicculture.org/donate/audio to help us out. We'll appreciate any kind of donation you can give and know that we pray for our benefactors daily. And now back to the show. Well, before we go any further, actually, it'd probably be a good idea to sort of explain the premise of this world and this story to people who haven't seen the film yet or read the book. There's so many different elements to it that it's almost difficult, but the sort of the as far as the film, the part 1 of the film is concerned, it kind of, the basic idea is that there's this planet called Arrakis, also known as Dune, which is a desert planet, kind of a backwater, but it happens to have the most valuable substance in the universe, which is the spice. And the spice, as I mentioned, is necessary for space travel. And that's because, as you mentioned, they got rid of computers. This is not explained in the part 1 of the film, but humanity was almost destroyed by AI. Humanity rose up and destroyed all the computers, and then in this thing called the Butlerian Jihad, and then basically instituted a commandment and a very, very strong taboo against making a machine in the likeness of a man's mind, I think is how it's put. And so they need this sort of psychedelic mind-expanding spice in order to make the incredible calculations needed for hyperspace travel or whatever, interstellar travel, without computers.
So the conceit, as Frank Herbert has it, is the spice basically expands the mind. So it does 2 things that are important. One of them is much more important to like the Bene Gesserit than it is to the navigators. But it basically allows the mind to look back over the collective racial memories of your line, see the past. And it also allows you to, gives you prescience for the future. You see that in the dreams that they have Paul have, that the powers of being able to expand your mind in that way, even just Bene Gesserit training, gives him prescient dreams where certain probability lines become obvious to him, though sometimes in garbled ways, in metaphor and vision. And so the idea for space travel is that the guild navigators basically live in a world of spice so that they can pick the best routes, hyperspace routes that are safe, so that you can travel between the empire, what would take hundreds, thousands of years under regular travel, using hyperspace about things in a safe way. The idea is if you didn't have the spice, you couldn't have the navigators. If you couldn't have the navigators, human civilization would fall apart. There'd be no way to link all these planets into an empire, into a culture, into into an overarching kind of culture, an overarching kind of rule of humanity, a union of humanity, because without the guild's ability to pick the safe hyperspace routes, humanity would be lost in that travel. It couldn't do that travel without the machines. And so your choice then is to risk again the kind of conquest of humanity by thinking machines, or to allow humanity to just turn back into the whole of humanity to anybody's view would be the people on their planet or the people in their solar system or something like that.
Yeah.
Versus all the people in the known universe, galaxy, whatever.
That's the spice. That's why Dune, this planet is important. But the premise of the plot is that there's these different noble houses sort of under the Emperor and Emperor of the known universe. And one of them is House Atreides, and our protagonist is the heir to is Paul Atreides, son and heir to Duke Leto, and Atreides is given the task of replacing the House Harkonnen, which had been in charge of Dune for 80 years, and bringing peace to the planet Arrakis and taking over the spice refinery and shipment, and it's incredibly lucrative work, an incredibly powerful position to have, and yet also very politically dangerous one, both because of jealousy and envy, and because of the fraught kind of situation on the planet itself, having to deal with the Fremen, who are the native people, who in the book are very much kind of like almost like Arab or Islamic tribes. And they still have somewhat of that vibe. I think some people have said they've been a little bit de-Islamicized for the movie, but they still kind of have that vibe. So it's then we've got, you know, Paul, the character, as you mentioned, has these abilities. His mother is a member of this order of women called the Bene Gesserit, which is named to sound like Jesuit because the author of the book, Frank Herbert, was educated by Jesuits. I don't know if he was Catholic or just sort of educated by Catholics, but I know he became a Buddhist later on. So their whole thing is that they manipulate bloodlines across hundreds or thousands of years in order to produce a person with an incredibly powerful mind that can bridge space and time. Why, I'm not sure. They want to do that, I'm not sure. But there's some possibility that Paul may be that person. And simultaneously, the Bene Gesserit, and this is where it gets kind of odd religiously, is they go around to different planets sowing mythology so that in case this looked for figure, who they call the Kwisatz Haderach, ever happens to emerge on a particular planet, because they don't know where he's going to come, the people there will be prepared to accept him as a sort of a messiah figure and put him in power. So that's basically the premise, the different ideas that are involved in this first half of the story. I guess you could also say the ecological concept is something that isn't fully developed in part one. But there's also this kind of this idea about humans adapting to their environment or adapting their environment to them. So you've got this incredibly hostile desert planet. In terms of the element, it's also got these really terrifying sandworms, which will, swallow you up if you don't walk in a certain way that avoids regular rhythmic patterns, so that they don't, come. And the Fremen have learned to adapt and live, so they're this incredibly tough and clever and adaptive people, even if barbarous, in various ways. And so Paul ends up sort of connecting with them as potentially their prophesied messiah figure. And then there's also this character who you mentioned, Liet Kynes, who is this imperial ecologist, and she has been living with the Fremen and kind of working on something that's not fully revealed in the first half of the story in this movie, but something that seems to be geared towards turning Arrakis into a more hospitable place to live, basically.
And that's a little clearer in the book, because there's a couple of conversations, like long conversations at meals and stuff, where Leto and Paul try to get more out of Kynes about this. This idea that Arrakis could be a paradise. There are ways to turn it into a lush green planet, that the planet could support that, but to do that kind of work might endanger the spice. And so the spice, being as important as it is, nobody wants to take the risk of endangering the spice and looking into the spice too deeply about that. And there are reasons the Fremen don't want that either, that are alluded to, but not yet made, I think, in the first movie explicit. And one thing that another thing I think Denis Villeneuve did well visually, one of the reasons the Fremen are so important, whether you want to make alliances with the Fremen, as the House Atreides does, or you want to wipe them out, as the Harkonnens do. They make this point, of course, that the Emperor secretly helps the Harkonnens near the end of the movie. He sends his Sardaukar, his terror troops or whatever, to help them destroy the Atreides. And one of the things you see when you're on the world where the Sardaukar are Seleucus Secundus, like it's this horrible, rainy, rocky place, and they're all out there in this pouring rain and stuff, and they're doing these salutes, and they're all... one of the parallels is that the reason the Fremen are so good is the same reason the Sardaukar are, is that they're living on a world they're formed and trained in a world that is horribly hostile to life. Different in different ways, obviously. Like when you see Seleucus Secundus, it looks different than it's not Arrakis. But that's also one of the points that I think he brings out visually in some ways that is made explicit in the book eventually, is that that's why the Sardaukar are so feared, and that's why the Fremen are so dangerous to the Emperor anyway, because in adapting and having to live in these harsh environments, they become incredibly tough, incredibly well-trained fighters, just like his Sardaukar. And so there's a reason there, while the Emperor would be leaning more toward the Harkonnen view. The Harkonnen will just wipe out the Fremen. They're a pain. They won't try to form an alliance with them, which makes anybody who does that dangerous to the Emperor, and especially for Atreides, there's implications even in the movie when Paul talks with Leto about this, like that he's respected by all these houses, that if he had that kind of power, who would back him against the Emperor? Because suddenly the Sardaukar aren't, the Emperor's going to drop Sardaukar on you. Well, now Leto can drop Fremen too. So which side do you know? So now you have a fighting chance. And I thought he did a really well job visualizing that. I mean, again, this is also, if you've read the book, you kind of know it, so maybe it's easier to see. But there's a lot of visual cues for that in the way he lays it out. And that's why the Fremen become kind of this wedge issue in the control of Arrakis, ultimately. And probably one of the reasons why the Emperor, I think, sides with the Harkonnens, that you're kind of eventually kind of given in some of these things, because it's all about, for the Emperor, it's about control. The most important thing is shoring up his position. Where, he might not like Vladimir Harkonnen, and he might like, on a personal level, Leto Atreides, but that's too bad, because, he can control Vladimir, he can control the Harkonnens much easier than he can control the Atreides, and if you're Emperor, that's, that might be the most important thing to you.
Yeah. Well, we've mentioned a few visual details of this, and, that's kind of, to my mind, one of the best things about this movie is simply that it is a great epic scale visual spectacle, but not of the kind that's just like constant explosions and, tons of CG and stuff like that. There certainly is CG, but they also went out to the desert and shot it. And it's this huge desert scapes that you see. And it's the sort of thing that you maybe don't get as much anymore in a way that feels real, and the way the kind of the sets that they build feel like a distinctive culture. And so I don't often these days go to a movie and get the feeling like I'm going into a new world and kind of like transported somewhere else. I really had this with this film, and honestly, this is, of recent films that I've seen in theaters, this is one of the ones that I'd say it's really worth seeing this one in a theater, particularly in IMAX. This film came out simultaneously on HBO Max because of a a deal that Warner Brothers did that Denis Villeneuve was none too happy about at the time, but he's been urging everybody to go see this movie in IMAX. That's how it was made to be seen. And I really would encourage that if you're going to see it, because it's just a great visual feast in that format.
Yeah, I think I would encourage the same thing. I saw it with another priest. We saw it on the big screen, and it was really worth doing. Not that you won't be able to necessarily enjoy it on a especially like on a nice TV, but to see it that size, there are certain things, of course, that in the medium of a novel that Frank Herbert had to like visually kind of, as any authors do, he's got to explain what Caladan looks like versus what Arrakis looks like when you get there. And there are these amazing shots of both the original Atreides homeworld, this lush, watered place, right? See, and and to see those powerful shots of these wide shots of that, and then to see those same wide shots on Dune of the desert, of the struggle, like you really, you don't need to use words. He did an excellent job of not needing to say too much to make you understand how big of a change this is for the House Atreides to go from Caladan to Arrakis to Dune. They are just such radically different environments. And both have their beauty and their danger. But just to see those like those wide sweeping shots as they're getting ready to leave of the hills and the sea of Caladan, and then to be landing in these wide sweeping shots of this.
And the ship that they go to the other planet in is literally underwater. It's covered in water, which is like, they have enough water to drench that giant ship in.
Like on Caladan, like all the ships are like underwater. Like that's where they store them, and then they get to Dune, and it's like water is, the most precious thing in the world, to the point where like it's a sacred duty to like water like these trees because otherwise they die. And so they're
right. Yeah. Well, there's a number of nice little distinctive things which make it a distinctive world, and I have some criticisms of the sound in this film, which I'll make later, mainly the mixing aspect of it, but the sound design is quite good and quite distinctive, as well as the different languages that some of the different houses use, like that sort of almost like Orc Scandinavian that this Sardaukar is. How do you say it?
That's how I say it.
Yeah, that they use, and the voice, which is kind of like what the Bene Gesserit use. It's kind of like a Jedi mind trick, but it involves pitching your voice in a certain way to get people to do what you want. That has like a very cool, distinctive, kind of scary sound. And then the other thing I really liked was and this extends to the way the combat works too, is the shields, because there's like an interesting hand-to-hand combat concept in Dune where they have these energy shields that look and sound very distinctive. I mean, you think about like Star Wars, where the sounds of the technology in Star Wars are so much of what bring you into that world. The sound of a TIE fighter and engine, the sound of a lightsaber, they're really memorable. And so you have a little bit of that with Dune, where you've got these shields. They have a memorable sound and a memorable look, where basically the way, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it is that you have to you can penetrate the shield only by moving slowly, because it's going to block something that moves fast. And so if you're coming at someone with a blade, you kind of have to move in slow. You have to move in slowly once you get close enough to kind of dig in through the shield, and then you can cut someone. Is that basically the idea of how they work?
Yes. The idea of the shield is that like they keep it's very hard to assassinate somebody from a long range, because you got to fire a projectile that's got to move fast. The shield will stop it. And but so if you're going to do blade work, you've got to be quick in the sense that you've got to get past guards and stuff, but then you have to slow down to penetrate the shield. If you strike someone too quickly, the shield will just block your blade. And so there's this very fascinating kind of fighting style that has to adapt, that everybody kind of has to adapt to be a master swordsman, where your fighting style has to be quick but also slow. which makes the fight, which is part of, I think, what makes the fights of the movie visually interesting. I think they did
it's a distinctive kind of.
Yeah, because once the shield's on, right, so you're fighting Duncan, Idaho, you have to be fast enough to get inside Duncan, Idaho's guard, but then you have to slow down enough that you can penetrate the shield. That's like,
right.
And so if you can't do that, then your shot's just going to bounce off the shield. And now you're inside his guard, while he's also inside yours, and that they showed that very well with the duels, Paul and Gurney at the beginning. Like, if I could get inside your guard, if you're not careful, I can get inside. If you can get inside mine, I can get inside yours. That kind of like, I've got you, old man. Well, we'd both die. But that importance of that uniqueness of what that means for hand-to-hand combat, that technological advantage against, like the sniper shot, becomes its own kind of thing. All personal combat has to be changed because of that. And it does give the thing a very distinctive style, which I thought they did an excellent job of kind of showing. They told you what you needed to know, but then they showed it to you. So they didn't spend a lot of discourse on it. You got some basic information about the slow blade is the killing blade. The shield stops anything fast, and then they showed you. And I thought that was well done.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you can tell like that Villeneuve really takes this book and the setting seriously, that he's very sincere in trying to do a respectful adaptation of it. And the exposition in this movie is handled really well, because he doesn't tell you everything. I mean, there's plenty of backstory that we talked about that he doesn't mention, at least in part one. But there is plenty of exposition in the movie, and I think it's handled very, very smoothly. I mean, arguably quite a bit of the first half of the movie is exposition in some form or another, but it's also exposition that sort of comes in the form of character development. So that we get Paul learning these things, it's useful to have a character who is having to learn things along with us. And, so when we see him in his combat training with Gurney Halleck, and we see how the shields work and everything. And so, I don't know, it's just very, very, I don't know if ept is a word, as opposed to inept, but it's very aptly done, compared to, many genre things that might be a little more clumsy in the exposition.
You never feel that they're telling Paul something that Paul should already know. Even where they might be, like in the Gurney scene, it's because Paul's being all, for lack of a better term, he's being kind of emo about the move and about what his dad won't let him do or will let him do. And so Gurney's got to smack his head up with the facts again. So it's not like, it doesn't feel like in the show where like, hello person who should know all this, but I'm going to tell you everything you need to know about using this computer that you've used 100 times because the audience has to know. It's more like, what's wrong with you, boy? Get your head in the game. This is how these things work, and you know this, and you've got to understand this. Or it's, hey, we're on a new planet. We have to learn the culture. We have to learn the ecology. We have to learn it in a way of, now we're living here. We're not just looking at a book about it, and the general kind of economic stuff. We need it, and we got ahead of time. And so in all those scenes, it's the plot of the movie, of the story allows for it, but you never feel like people are being told things they should know. It's people are being told things they need to know because now they need to know them.
Yeah. The another big area where I think the movie excels is just its characterization, in particular with all these different kind of advisors and subordinates to the Duke. I think all of them are really well cast, well characterized. I mean, it's a great cast. And many people have said Jason Momoa kind of steals the show as Duncan Idaho. I'm sympathetic to that opinion. I think he's a great character. He's kind of he is the weapons master and kind of the best fighter. But then you've got Josh Brolin playing Gurney Halleck, who is also a warrior, a kind of a warrior bard, I guess. We don't see him play his stringed instrument, the balisette, in this. I'm hoping we will in the next part. But we do hear him quoting poetry or scripture or something at a number of points. And so there's just these nice little touches like that. I even like the character of Thufir Hawat, who is the mentat to Duke Leto. The villains are, of course, good. The Harkonnens, Jessica Ferguson is good. as Paul's mother, and Oscar Isaac is really great as the Duke, and he's such he is a character who's very likable. It's nice to see a movie with these kind of not perfect, but kind of just very normal in a way male protagonists, and the Duke being this kind of really obviously honorable and you know, kind of principled man, who's put in a very difficult situation. And I think all of those things, all of those characters are really well distinguished from one another and fleshed out given the short amount of time that we might have with, say, a character like Gurney Halleck.
I think that's true. I think that you get a perspective on all of them that is true to who they are. You know, that obviously in a book they could be more developed than that. And I'm sure that a number of them will be continually developed in part 2. But you get a sense. None of the senses I got from the characters felt in any way wrong. They felt very good. Especially, I was very pleased with Oscar Isaac as Duke Leto. I think Duke Leto is important, and I don't know. I remember the first read when Kynes thought, I like this Duke. I was like, yeah, so do I. And so that makes his fall and what happens to him as part of this overarching kind of scheme. It makes it hits you, I think, in the way it's meant to hit you. And I think that I certainly felt that at the end of part 1 with Oscar Isaacs, and I just thought it was really good. And I also liked his casting. I mean, I know people. One of the things about the casting of this movie is people making all kinds of comments of this or that. I mean, to me, in my mind, I mean, certainly there's something about Kaladin as rocky and watery that evokes Scotland, and I think that you see that in the. Denis brings it out, and Villeneuve brings it out with the bagpipes and stuff when they land.
I love that.
But there is something very Spanish about them too. Like, it's a very big thing in the book that Leto's dad died in a bullfight, but he killed the bull, right. And so it's a big deal that like that head. And you see them in the movie, but there's a huge fight. They have a fight about this actually. Jessica hates those things. Like that, he killed the bull even though it killed him, and they lacquered those horns, and that's his real blood on those horns, and that's a big deal for the House Atreides. Like there's honor in that. Like the bull killed him, but he killed the bull, and those are part of their heritage.
That's such a great human touch that tells you so much about House Atreides that they have in the movie. Those continual shots of that bull on the wall and of the little sculpture of him
and
fighting
Paul
the bull.
Your dad died fighting a bull. He's like, yep, but
right.
But
the painting.
There is that kind of kind of Spanish. That's a very Spanish kind of as bullfighting exists not just in Spain but across Latin America. That's a very Spanish kind of thing. So I think Oscar Isaacs was a good choice, and certainly as an actor, he was a fine choice. He proved that I think very well in this movie, and I really he was Leto to me. I didn't feel it was.
Sure. This is a movie where colorblind casting actually ended up working pretty seamlessly. My co-host observed, we saw The Green Knight recently, which we don't recommend. And that movie was cast colorblind, but in a way that I think is a little more distracting and it makes less sense in its setting than in this. That's also worth mentioning. They did change the sex of one of the characters, the ecologist Liet Kynes, but that seems to work fine. Liet Kynes is one of the more kind of mysterious characters in this film because you don't get a full understanding of really what she was up to, and I think we'll probably end up learning more about what she had been up to on Arrakis prior to the arrival of House Atreides in the next installment. But she also, unfortunately, I don't know the name of that actress, but she also did a good job simply through her acting of conveying this kind of ambivalent stance that Liet Kynes has, and this kind of... go ahead.
No, I think it's important because Liet Kynes is, what's the line that I'm accepted in both Siege and city or town or whatever it is. Like Liet Kynes is the character Liet Kynes is in some ways very divided. I believe I just read part of that. I was just reading some of the stuff in the book, and at some point Duke Leto thinks Kynes has gone native, in a sense. So Kynes is a Fremen, but also Kynes is an Imperial, has to deal with the city and the rulers of the planet, because Kynes is an Imperial ecologist. Kynes is a person who, at least in some ways, is very compelled by the Fremen religion, but also very compelled by their her in the movie scientific outlook. Kynes is a person who respects Duke Leto, learns that this is a good man, but is also under orders by the Emperor as an Imperial judge of the change to ignore all kinds of things, to make it harder for the Atreides, to make it easier for them to ultimately get destroyed, and to let that happen in a manner in which it can be seen as falling under what they call canly. I don't know if that term was used in the movie, I can't remember, but that's a term in the book for like a grudge between royal houses, or between noble houses, and there's like an ancient grudge between the Harkonnens and the Atreides, and so there are rules to that, right? There are things you can do and things you can't do, and so part of the whole thing is like, you can't know the Sardaukar were there, you can't know the Emperor was doing anything, because if we find out that, then that ruins things. But if it was just the Harkonnens after the Atreides had become established, now that falls under the rules of this grudge, etc. And so Kynes is that very torn character who, I think that's there in the book too. I think, Kynes is moving toward an integration of all that, and has it in some respects, but you do see in the actions that she has to take. I think that is conveyed very well, again, in visual and things like that the actress brings across, without having to give us a whole info dump. Liet Kynes is very conflicted because of these 5 things, like I just did, right? But you just can get that in the movie by the actress's ability to kind of convey, oh wow, this guy cares about the people more than the spice, but I'm the Imperial ecologist, and I'm a Fremen, but I'm also an Imperial citizen. Right. And, I think that is all conveyed by the acting and the limited dialogue and the scenery. Like when you're in the bunker of the ecology bunker and you see all the water plants and stuff, that tells you something that, if you're quick, you can pick that up without having known Kynes from the book, without having known Kynes' end game as explained a little more fleshed out in the novel. It's still there. And if you're a viewer who ponders those things and catches those things, it's there for you. And as it gets fleshed out in part 2, it either won't be a surprise or it'll be a happy surprise. You're like, oh yeah, I remember seeing that in part 1. That makes sense. Which I think is the best way to do this, kind of visually, and then bring it up in dialogue when it becomes important. Where I think that I trust Villeneuve to do that in part 2.
Yeah,
I have no reason not to at this point.
So, do you have any criticisms of this film from an adaptation standpoint?
I could say this or that a little bit. I would have liked to have seen, just like I would like to see Tom Bombadil in the Lord of the Rings movies, right? But I know why he was cut. Film is a different medium than prose. I think the only thing that I really had an issue with, so it's supposed to be, Dr. Yue as the traitor, that's supposed to be a huge deal, because the Sook School of Medicine is supposed to train these guys who work on the Imperial houses. They are unable to betray, right? And so it's supposed to be a major deal that the Harkonnens found with his wife, and having tortured her and blah, blah, and he knowing what Harkonnens do to prisoners. But it's supposed to be a major, that's the thing in the book. There are people who don't trust each other for years, and it has to be explained by Paul or Jessica when they come back, when he kind of runs into his people again as who survived. No, this is who the traitor was, and because nobody would think that. Nobody would ever, in the book, there's a whole thing where suspicion is turning left and right. In the book, it's very clear. Jessica doesn't trust Thufir. Thufir doesn't trust Jessica. Well, that's because none of them possibly think Yue is even possible as the traitor. And I get that. How do you do that in the info dump on the Sook School? But when you're not doing prose, but it just made Yue's betrayal and the fact that nobody considered him, it just doesn't have the impact that it does in the book. In the book, it's this should have been impossible. And it's amazing that the Harkonnens are able to do this. And it speaks to how much Yue loved his wife. It speaks to how cruel the Harkonnens are to their prisoners. and it speaks to how manipulative the Baron can be. It tells you a lot about their character, that because of those circumstances, the impossible became possible. And that it's not there in the movie because they don't have the space or the ability. They couldn't find a good way to do that kind of pass that information along. And so while Yue's betrayal is, oh man, that's horrible that their trusted doctor would betray them, it doesn't have the same impact because in the universe of Dune, that's supposed to be impossible. The conditioning that a Sook medical student goes through so that they can work on these high imperial houses, these dukes, these barons, even the emperor, like it's supposed to be an unbreakable conditioning. And it tells you a lot about who Yue is and who the Harkonnens are, that in those circumstances, the conditioning could be broken. And that's just one thing I felt that didn't have the impact it could have. But I'm not sure how you could have done it better without having one of those moments where, like, now I'm going to tell you a thing you should know. It's impossible to break Sook conditioning, So I don't know how they could have done that better and put that in. But I just noticed that if you do know the story already, you realize that it's not going to have the impact on people who don't know it that it does when you read the novel the first time, because this is supposed to be an impossible thing. And so it's not on anybody's
right. Well, that's
mind.
Interesting because it is kind of in the film. It is just kind of like a textbook betrayal. Oh, they had his wife, know. But it makes it more distinctive when you talk about the consequences that betrayal has, because nobody could believe that he would have done it. Okay, so what format did you see this in? IMAX or regular? Or
I think we were in the IMAX. I didn't buy the tickets. My friend did. I bought the Thai food for dinner. He bought the tickets and the popcorn. Gotcha. So I let that all up to him. But I think we saw. I know the theater we saw had IMAX. I think it might have been IMAX. It might have been regular. Okay. I'm not a super technical guy on those kind of grounds. Like, it was a big screen. It was better than watching on a TV I have in the rectory, which is better than the TV I would have had in my college dorm. And that's about what I can tell you.
Wow.
But
except in one respect, which is that on the TV at home you could have had subtitles, which brings us to the sound mixing and volume of this movie. So was it incredibly loud when you saw it?
Yes, and there were parts where music was playing, especially during precognitive dreams, where I was like, okay, is that music? Is that chanting that's part of music that's hard for me to understand because it's not supposed to be understood? It's in some other language and it's mixed up really high in with this. Or am I supposed to understand what's being said here because it matters to Paul's dreams, or it matters to this or that?
Yes.
And there were a lot of parts where there was like that, where I was not sure if I was missing something in the sense of information is being conveyed in a manner, but I can't understand it due to this mixing.
Right.
Or was I missing something in the sense that I'm just thinking too hard about the score and thinking I'm missing something. And so I'm really missing is the impact the score should be having on me.
There's a number of elements to this, and first of all, the sheer loudness of the movie. Now, IMAX movies are generally loud, generally super loud. I am of the opinion with films as with music, that it's obviously wrong to have sound that can damage your hearing, in art. And my ears are still ringing from seeing it in IMAX, it's. I read a comment online by an audio engineer who said that this movie actually pushes the legal limits of how loud a film can be in the theater. And it's not just distinctive to where we saw it. IMAX the company actually determines the levels within like a certain narrow range. But this movie was also just mixed super loud. And this same somebody else said that, a door closing in Dune is louder than a gun firing in the new Bond movie. So that in itself kind of makes for a somewhat unpleasant oral experience, just the sheer loudness of it. But then the other aspect of it is kind of the mixing. So the bass and this is true both for sound effects and score, but there's a fair amount of mumbled or whispered dialogue in here, especially of certain key scenes from Paul and his mother. And I miss quite a number of those mumbled lines because of the way that they were mixed. I mean, there's a lot of alternation of whispering and really loud noise or music in this film. The really big example I would give is the famous Gom Jabbar scene where we have Jessica standing outside the door as Paul is being put to the test. She's saying the famous litany against fear, which is the most famous lines in all of Dune. I will not fear. Fear is the mind killer, et cetera, et cetera. And you can't understand half of it. I mean, if I didn't know it already, I wouldn't have caught quite a bit of what she was saying there because of everything else being so loud. And she's kind of whispering it in a kind of emotional, hyperventilating way. And I have to say, that's just like an objectively bad sound mixing decision. I don't think it's like a subjective opinion thing. I think that if you're missing important lines, then that's a real problem. So I don't know why they did that. Apparently this is kind of I've heard people say this is kind of a trend in certain types of movies the past several years, to have that kind of like constant alternation between like very quiet dialogue and slightly overlapping with like really loud noises or music. But it was kind of a frustrating thing.
Yeah. And that's true. And you know what? That actually brings up the one other thing that I was thinking I forgot about adaptation. I know they didn't want to use like Lynch voiceovers, but like when you have Jessica mumbling all those things, it kind of cuts into the kind of Bene Gesserit style she's supposed to have. Like in the book, it's very clear that she's thinking these things, and her poise is poised. Like all these are internal.
Yes.
And I understand not wanting to do a copy of Lynchian kind of, now we're just going to have the thoughts being heard by recording the actor, but I was kind of, I know Jessica's going through something and it's very powerful there, but like the book always implies that you barely notice anything to me, and maybe that's me bringing my interpretation to Herbert's text, but it was always like she's going through this rough internal struggle, but because of her Bene Gesserit training, you barely notice anything on the outside.
Yeah, in the movie, she's often, craing with her head bowed and kind of.
And
like
that's a choice, I think, just because like how are you going to let the actors emote and show Jessica's feelings in a way, and it's just it's not the choice I would have probably made, but I didn't direct a bunch of great sci-fi movies that everybody loves. So I mean, what's my criticism worth? But that was just a thing. That was another little thing. And you're right, that does, because she's. And almost like the whispering is almost part of it, trying to convey that, like she's really bothered, but she's controlled still. But yeah, with the mixing, what is she saying?
Right.
And you're right. Like it's one of those things where like, well, if you've read the book a couple of times, or just you're a sci-fi person, and you know this litany because it's the most famous line in the whole book, and it's all over the place. Sure, you know what she's saying. But if you're coming to Dune cold, like, oh, I heard this is a major thing, and I liked Denis Villeneuve's other movies, I'm gonna go watch this. Like, I will not fear, blah, blah, like something.
You're not going to miss a lot of major plot details, but you are going to miss some somewhat important lines, I think.
Things that kind of are traditionally vital, like not vital, but what's the word?
They're vital to the ethos of it. Yeah. If not the plot.
It's a fundamental part of what this universe is. And so you won't, like, you don't hear the full litany of against fear. You're not going to be confused later on with a plot point, but in some ways, you have not experienced Dune in the way somebody who knows that has.
Right. So the other thing I was thinking about is like, okay, it is standard for IMAX movies to be loud. But, I think that there's kind of like a real stupidity in drawing the connection between a big screen and extreme loudness and volume. Like the idea that IMAX should be so loud because the screen is bigger. It's kind of like thinking that having the screen is brighter, screen be brighter would always be better. Like, no, that the correct analogy would be between having a big, great resolution and having like detail and range of sound, but not simply like loudness of sound.
I think that's true.
So and often you can hear it less well when it's louder. Especially if you've got like rumble seats or something like that.
Well, and there are places where loudness makes sense. Like it makes sense to have it loud when like the whole flock of Atreides ships is landing on Dune, and here's their army coming out, and all their bagpipes are playing. All right, that makes sense. If this were a real thing and you were there, this would be loud. Because all these ships are coming, thousands of troops are marching to hundreds of bagpipes. But not everything needs to be loud. There are places where being loud makes perfect sense, because this is the kind of thing that if you were in this world, this would be loud. And so it doesn't hurt to have a loud score.
Yeah.
and to kind of hit you with that this is something major and loud. But yeah, like when a mom is outside of a locked room, fearing for her son that he passed this deadly test to prove he's, what was it like? What is it? It's to prove he's human, in the moral sense. That's not the intensity of those emotions doesn't make them loud. In fact, because Jessica's a Bene Gesserit, they're kind of not loud, at least in a visible way, right? So it would make sense there to have a powerful score that you can do a powerful score without having it be super loud. That would actually, for this completely inexpert opinion, I think that would work better. But like, again, what do I know?
And this relates to my other related criticism, which is I've never been a worshiper of Hans Zimmer, but this is the first time where I thought his music made a film worse. Now there's a couple of memorable motifs in it. There's a couple of nice moments, but he really, a big part of the too loudness of this movie is the music, and it's kind of one note. I mean, it's a fairly monotonous score. He's just hitting you whenever something is happening with these big noises and, kind of big bass things. And, I think that the movie, would have been much better served by a little bit more of a restrained score. It's like that whole time, I don't know, just any time that you get something happening, you've got these huge, super loud war drums, or and when it happens over and over again, it starts to become a little bit tedious. The score is not commensurate with the movie, because the movie is not hammering you over the head with things. I mean, it is epic. It does make an impression, but this is a movie that takes its time. It's got plenty of character development and plot development, especially in the first half. It proceeds fairly slowly for a lot of that. And so it doesn't fit to have a score that is such a blunt instrument so much of the time.
Dune shows that you can. I always like Dune because in some ways Dune is very much like a Sword and Planet novel. You're dropped onto this planet that you don't know. You meet these people who are, maybe a little less technologically advanced, but are full of nobility, and you turn them in, and you join them, and they become a way to overthrow tyranny, whatever. It's very Swords and Planety, but It's got a lot of big ideas in it. But the big ideas aren't dropped on you in like philosophical dialogues of chapters 5 through 10, where it's like, now you're reading the sci-fi version of Plato. They come up in the action, in the thing. And I think that's what, I think in a very real way, like that's one of the comparisons I have with I think, Tolkien and Herbert, is that there are plenty of big ideas in The Lord of the Rings and in Dune. But you don't get the big ideas in your next 3 chapters are going to be, 3 platonic dialogues. It's like, well, you're going to learn stuff as people fill in necessary information, as somebody mentions a scrap of poetry, as you fight a new thing or have to overcome a new struggle and figure out what that means. And so the action is there, the character development is there, the motion of the story is there, and the big ideas are told through that. I'm not opposed to big ideas in science fiction. I'm opposed to somebody selling me a science fiction novel that is actually wants to be a dime store platonic dialogue. Like if I want to read The Republic, I'll read The Republic. I've done it 2 or 3 times. I'll probably do it a couple more times before I die. But when I pick up a sci-fi novel, I want a story, and if you want to give me big ideas, give it to me through the story. I think Frank Herbert does that very well. And I think that insofar as adapting Frank Herbert to the big screen, Denis Villeneuve did that very well.
Okay, so at this point, for our last topic of discussion, I'm going to just say, feel free to give spoilers and feel free to just talk about the book if you want, and the whole of the story. So I wanted to give you a chance to talk about a little bit about kind of a Catholic perspective on the religious and kind of psychological, metaphysical aspects of the story. I mean, there's a number of things. I mean, there's this kind of like what you could read as a cynical, first, one thing you could say is that in the book, it's pretty clear that, correct me if I'm wrong, the Catholic Church no longer exists. There's or it certainly is a pretty obscure sect at that point. You've got this kind of ecumenical conglomeration with the Orange Catholic Bible, which is a mixture of.
And you see that a lot. This kind of naturalistic religion. Like you'll meet them later on in other books, the Zen Sunni. So Sunni Islam mixed with Zen Buddhism, at least, or the Orange Catholic, Catholicism and Protestantism have come together again in a syncretic way. So there's that kind of thing there. Of course, there's also the kind of thing, and certainly in Dune itself, I'm not sure they even know where Earth is anymore. So after the thinking machine wars and the Butlerian Jihad and the thousands of years, but there is this kind of cynical thing about. I think what it comes down to, though, certainly it's there with Paul. Like, is Paul a Messiah? Well, no, not really. Paul is thought to be a Messiah because the Bene Gesserit have sown seeds to make life easier for themselves and easier for their breeding program. If you can sow seeds of mythology in different cultures where, oh yeah, Bene Gesserit are good and anybody who's like them is good and they're holy and stuff like that. I really think there is
this idea of religion as a very long-term plan of social engineering
and
could be a little bit cynical.
I don't know if I would say that I get from the book that that's what all religion is, so much as that's what the Bene Gesserit use religion for. And I think there is a cautionary tale in Dune about trying to build messiahs up for human reasons. This idea that we sow the right mythology, we do the right things, we socially engineer people so we can have somebody step into this gap and do what needs doing, right? I mean, the Bene Gesserit breeding program and stuff isn't supposed to be ultimately, is in their mind for the good of humanity. But when you manipulate these things falsely, you don't get good things. As you go into the future books, things don't turn out well for Paul. Things don't turn out well for a lot of things. And insofar as they do turn out well, they turn out well almost by accident, where a bunch of other forces that are like, eventually you'll meet another group of women who are the honored matre, who are the opposite of the Bene Gesserit, or the extreme version of the Bene Gesserit, depending on your perspective. They come up in like Chapter House and stuff and things like that, Dune and Heretics of Dune. But so there's this kind of view that I think there is in Herbert's view, whether he thought this or not. I think the story plays out where like religion has to be religion first. If it's not religion first, if religion becomes a tool of power, rather than if faith is supposed to tell us, from a Catholic perspective, the faith has political consequences, right? There are related to justice, related to the common good, right? That's, but faith has to be faith, right? And because of faith shines that light that enlightens our intellect, that says things then to us, expanding our own, what we can come to know by natural law, telling us something about how we should organize our society. But the wrong way about that, this is why Action Française was ultimately condemned. The idea that I don't have to believe in the faith, I just have to use it as an important tool to get my country to be what it should be. That's not really the right way to go about things. And insofar as you want to draw a Catholic lesson from Dune, I think that's one of the big ones, is that you cannot, faith has to really be faith, and then that has consequences for politics, for moral life, for how people live together. But you can't be like, well, we need to build a better society and a better human race. So let's use religion as a tool to do that. Dune, I think, or something. And it becomes clearer in some ways as you go through the books into Messiah and children, certainly, that when you do that, when you use religion as a tool, as the Bene Gesserit do, rather than believing and then having that, it backfires spectacularly in some ways and causes a lot of pain and a lot of hurt. And I think that's a fundamental truth, right? If you go about things the wrong way, if you make the faith subservient to something rather than the faith as the thing that enlightens everything, it is going to cause problems. If you're the crazy psychic emperor of the known universe, as Paul is at the end of Dune, it's going to cause problems for a lot of people besides yourself. There's going to be personal problems and personal pains, but there's also going to be galaxy-wide ones that are going to affect a lot of others. And so from my perspective, in some regards, certainly Dune itself and for the immediate sequels before you jump the couple thousand years and Leto's Golden Path and stuff, which is the stuff I've reread least, so the stuff I can speak on least with authority. But I think for the first couple of books, it's kind of there very clearly that when you make religion a tool in making humanity be what you want it to be, it ends up causing a lot more pain than it does good, because that's not how it's supposed to work. Certainly from, and as a Catholic, obviously the true religion is the Catholic faith, and the Catholic faith literally teaches that the point of Catholicism is salvation, and that means something for how you run politics, whatever form of government you pick. That means something for how the state respects the rights of the church. It means something for what the common good of humanity really is, which is not just this worldly, but eternity, right? But that's the case because Catholicism is true and there has to be the guiding factor in our political and our personal lives, not because we want to build a better world, so let's use Catholicism as a tool to do that. And that can be a subtle thing, but I think that Dune in some ways shows the danger of using religion as a tool to build a better world rather than religion as the overarching guiding principle that tells us how we are to live in communion with each other and ultimately with God, if that makes sense.
There's another aspect that might be worth commenting on, which is kind of the assignation of like quasi-mystical abilities to like simple brain development. So, Paul's ability to kind of see the future, or at least alternative futures. There's this idea I seem to remember of kind of like almost like the Bene Gesserit can be like possessed by ancestral voices.
Yeah, that happens. That happens.
I'm not sure what what the metaphysical explanation of that is.
Well, yeah, it's like he was bringing in this view that there was genetic memory. That's a big thing in Dune. Genetic memory becomes a bigger thing in the second half once you get to God Emperor and stuff, because there's clones called Gola, and by doing certain things you can make them remember their previous lives because all your memories are stored everywhere or something. There's this view of genetic memory, and so when you fully open the Bene Gesserit, like especially, that's why women can't look down certain paths, because if they did, they could be possessed by the ancestral spirit. That is a huge thing that plays out in the sequels in Messiah and Children. Yeah, and there is that.
Don't
there
we
is that.
hear some female voices,
like
some female kind of crone voices speaking to Paul in the movie during his vision, some of his visions?
Well, there's...
is that a reference to that?
It might be, yeah. I think so. I mean... Yeah, but there's that view too, like he doesn't understand them, right? Like, prophets don't always understand their visions, but this ability is because he has used Bene Gesserit training to unlock his mind. There is that. There is this kind of naturalization, and that's a very sci-fi thing, because you don't always want to acknowledge supernatural in a science, because then people are like, it's fantasy. So like, oh, well, now it's psychic powers and genetic memory and stuff like that.
Right.
Warhammer 40K just says, nope, there's a warp and there's demons. So, in some respects, it's more realistic than Dune.
Right. It does get on my nerves sometimes when they're like try to have like a scientific version of some like spiritual type thing. Well, okay. I don't know if you have any other remarks to make, but otherwise we can wrap up.
I think it's worth seeing. I don't know if it will please every fan of the novels, but certainly I think Denis Villeneuve respects the source material. And if you don't agree with all his choices, that's fine. Not everything is everybody's cup of tea. But as a fan of the novels, I never felt insulted. I didn't feel like he did anything. It wasn't a hit job. It wasn't somebody who hated the source material. It was somebody who loved the source material, making decisions. Some of them I would have made differently if I were the director, probably, or the scriptwriter. But that's, there's a reason I'm a priest and he's a director and a scriptwriter, and that might be one of the reasons for it. His decisions might be in the long run be better than mine. But in the end, I thought it was a respectful adaptation. I'm looking forward to seeing part 2 and hoping it continues this way. I don't regret having seen it in any way. And while I still love the David Lynch movie,
So you think David Lynch is worth watching? I haven't seen it.
I think David, well, he himself was not happy with it because
it's an experience.
Because who was the production guy? De Laurentiis, wouldn't let him, made him shave 15 minutes out to make it under 2 hours. It was originally going to be 2:15 or something, or 2:10, and it's slightly under 2.
Interesting.
Because he didn't believe anybody would sit in the theater for over 2 hours, and so not even Lynch is happy with his final product because he wanted another 15 to 20 minutes to really do things. I saw it after I read the book, so a lot of things that might have been confusing for people who hadn't read the book were confusing for me. I'd say if you've seen Denis Villeneuve's Dune or you've read Frank Herbert's Dune and you like David Lynch, it's worth seeing. Don't feel they have to, but I like it. So,
well, my plan is to reread Dune before the second part comes out. But yes, like you, I am looking forward to the second part. I think there's some speculation that he might actually end up doing Dune Messiah as well. I'm not sure if he will, but he seems open to the idea, taking things one step at a time. Father Brendon, thank you for joining me to discuss this film. People can find you on Twitter, yes, at Padre Brendon, and that's Brendon spelled with an O.
Yeah, it's an E and an O. Brendon.
That's right.
That's how my mom swears to me. She saw it in every saint book she ever looked in when they were naming me, which is weird because I've never seen a saint book that spells it that way, but I'm not going to distrust my sainted mother. So.
All right. Well, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.